Volume -1, The Age of Accountability. Chapter 1, The World Has Changed. There was a time when ordinary people had almost no way to understand the rules that governed their lives. The laws were hidden in books they could not access, the procedures were known only to officials, and the decisions made by people in authority were rarely questioned. Most citizens simply trusted that the people in charge knew what they were doing. And if something felt unfair, there was little they could do about it. That world is gone. Today, the rules are no longer locked away. Anyone with a phone or a computer can read the laws that apply to them. They can look up the procedures that must be followed. They can see the limits of authority written in plain language. They can save emails, record dates, and keep copies of every notice they receive. They can compare what happened to what was supposed to happen. And once a person can do that, they are no longer powerless. This change did not happen all at once. It came slowly, as more information became public and more systems moved online. But the result is something remarkable. An ordinary citizen now has access to the same rules that bind the people in charge. A person who takes the time to read those rules can understand the structure behind authority. They can see when a procedure is followed and when it is ignored. They can tell the difference between a real policy and something that was made up on the spot. They can recognize when a decision is lawful and when it is simply emotional. This shift has created a new kind of power. Not the power to control others, but the power to protect oneself. When someone understands the rules, they can stand on solid ground even when the person in authority is standing on sand. They can ask questions that matter. They can point to the documents that govern the situation. They can insist that the process be followed. And they can do all of this without raising their voice or getting into an argument. The strength comes from the structure itself. We are living in a time when this kind of knowledge is more valuable than ever. Many authority figures were never trained in jurisprudence. They know their daily tasks, but not the architecture behind them. They know what they want to happen, but not what the rules require. When someone in authority acts on instinct instead of procedure, the person who knows the rules becomes the anchor in the room. They become the one who brings the situation back to the written structure. This is the beginning of the age of accountability. It is an age where transparency gives ordinary people the ability to understand the systems around them. It is an age where documentation protects the individual. It is an age where knowing the rules is enough to change the outcome of a conflict. And it is an age where a person does not need special training or a professional title to stand up for themselves. They only need the willingness to read, to pay attention, and to keep records. The world has changed. Authority is no longer unquestionable. The rules are no longer hidden. And the citizen who understands the structure is no longer powerless. This book begins with that simple truth, because everything that follows grows from it. Chapter 2. When authority doesn't know the rules. Most people assume that authority is built on knowledge. They imagine that the people in charge understand the rules better than anyone else, that they have been trained in the laws they enforce, and that their decisions come from a place of structure and certainty. But in everyday life, this is rarely true. Many authority figures know their routines, but not the rules behind them. They know what they want to happen, but not what the process requires. They know the job, but not the architecture. This gap is not always obvious at first. It shows up in small ways. A manager makes a decision because that's how we've always done it. A supervisor enforces a rule that doesn't exist in writing. An administrator ignores a required step because they didn't know it was required. A policy is treated like a law even though it was never adopted properly. None of this comes from bad intentions. It comes from a lack of training in the structure that governs their authority. Authority without structure becomes emotional. When someone doesn't know the rules, they fall back on feelings. They rely on instinct, habit, or frustration. They make decisions based on what seems right in the moment instead of what the procedure demands. And because they believe they are in charge, they assume their decisions are automatically valid. They don't realize that authority is not a feeling. It is a framework. It is a set of limits. It is a structure that must be followed, not invented. This is where problems begin for ordinary people. When authority acts on emotion instead of law, The person on the receiving end feels the impact. A notice is issued without the required documentation. A meeting is skipped even though the procedure requires it. A policy is enforced even though it was never adopted. A decision is made without the steps that protect both sides. The citizen experiences the consequences, while the authority figure may not even realize they stepped outside the boundaries. The surprising truth is that many authority figures have never been taught jurisprudence. They have never been shown how to read a statute, how to interpret a rule, or how to follow a procedure from start to finish. They may have years of experience, but experience is not the same as structure. Without the structure, they rely on memory, workplace culture, or personal judgment. And when those things replace the written rules, mistakes become almost guaranteed. This is not a rare situation. It happens in housing offices, schools, hospitals, workplaces, and government buildings. It happens in small towns and large cities. It happens anywhere someone has power but not the training to use it correctly. The pattern is the same. Authority acts on instinct, and the citizen is left to deal with the fallout. But this chapter is not about blaming anyone. It is about understanding the landscape. When you recognize that authority often does not know the rules, you stop assuming that every decision is correct. You stop believing that every action is lawful just because someone in charge said so. You begin to see the difference between what someone wants to do and what they're allowed to do. And once you see that difference, you can navigate the situation with clarity instead of confusion. The truth is simple. Authority is only as strong as its understanding of the rules. When that understanding is missing, authority becomes fragile. It becomes inconsistent. It becomes unpredictable. And in those moments, the person who knows the structure, even at a basic level, becomes the most grounded person in the room. This chapter sets the stage for what comes next. If authority often doesn't know the rules, then the citizen who does becomes powerful in a way that previous generations could not imagine. The next chapter explores that power and how it changes the balance between ordinary people and the systems around them. Chapter 3: The Power of Knowing the Rules. There is a quiet strength that comes from understanding the rules that govern a situation. It is not loud or aggressive. It does not rely on force or authority. It does not require a title or a position. It comes from something much simpler, knowing how the system is supposed to work. When a person understands the structure behind authority, they gain a kind of confidence that cannot be taken away from them. Most people never experience this feeling. They go through life assuming that the rules are too complicated or too hidden for them to understand. They believe that only professionals or officials can make sense of the system. But the truth is that many of the rules that matter most are written in plain language. They are designed to be understood by ordinary people. And once someone takes the time to read them, the world around them begins to look different. Knowing the rules changes how you see authority. You stop assuming that every decision is correct just because someone in charge made it. You stop feeling intimidated by official language or formal letters. You stop believing that you have no choice but to accept whatever happens. Instead, you begin to see the structure behind the actions. You can tell when a step was skipped. You can recognize when a requirement was ignored. You can notice when something doesn't match the written procedure. And once you see those things, you cannot unsee them. This knowledge does not make you confrontational. It makes you steady. When someone in authority acts on emotion, you do not have to match their emotion. When they rely on habit instead of procedure, you do not have to follow their habit. When they assume you will not question them, you do not have to argue. You can simply point to the rules. You can ask calm, simple questions. You can request the documents that the procedure requires. You can stand on the written structure instead of on feelings. This is where the real power lies. A person who knows the rules does not need to raise their voice. They do not need to threaten or demand. They do not need to be dramatic. The strength comes from the fact that the rules are not personal. They do not change based on who is involved. They do not bend to emotion. They do not disappear because someone is frustrated. They are written down and they apply to everyone. When you understand the rules, you also understand something deeper. Authority is not magic. It is not a personal trait. It is not something someone has just because they hold a position. Authority is a structure. It is created by documents, procedures, and limits. And when someone steps outside those limits, their authority becomes weaker, not stronger. A citizen who knows the rules can see this clearly, even when the authority figure cannot. This kind of knowledge is not about winning. It is about clarity. It is about being able to navigate situations that would otherwise feel confusing or overwhelming. It is about protecting yourself without needing to fight. It is about understanding that the system is not a mystery. It is a set of written steps, and anyone who reads them can understand how they work. The power of knowing the rules is not theoretical. It shows up in real situations every day. A person who understands the procedure can ask for the meeting that was skipped. They can request the notice that was never given. They can ask for the policy that was supposedly enforced. They can point out when a requirement was ignored. And in many cases, simply asking these questions is enough to change the entire direction of the situation. This chapter marks the turning point in the age of accountability. Once you understand that authority often does not know the rules and that you can learn them yourself, the balance shifts. You no longer feel powerless. You no longer feel confused. You no longer feel like you are at the mercy of someone else's emotions. You stand on the structure, and the structure holds. The next chapter explores the tool that makes this possible: documentation. Because knowing the rules is powerful, but being able to show what happened in writing is what turns that knowledge into action. Chapter 4: Documentation as a Shield. There is a simple truth that many people overlook. The moment something is written down, it becomes part of the structure. A spoken claim can be forgotten, denied, or reshaped by emotion. But a written record stands on its own. It does not change based on who remembers it. It does not shift based on how someone feels later. It becomes a fixed point in time, something solid that can be returned to when everything else becomes unclear. This is why documentation is one of the most powerful tools an ordinary person can use. It turns a confusing situation into something that can be understood. It turns a disagreement into something that can be examined. It turns a moment of uncertainty into a piece of evidence. And it gives the citizen a shield that does not depend on anyone else's memory or mood. Many people never think to document what happens to them. They assume that the person in authority will keep accurate records. They assume that the system will remember the details. They assume that the truth will be obvious later. But systems forget. People forget. And authority figures often do not document things as carefully as they should. When a situation becomes complicated, the person who kept records is the one who can show what actually happened. Documentation does not have to be complicated. It can be as simple as saving emails, writing down dates, keeping copies of notices, or taking pictures of posted rules. These small actions create a trail that shows the sequence of events. They show what was said, what was done, and what was required. They show whether the procedure was followed or ignored. And they show it in a way that cannot be argued with because the record speaks for itself. When someone in authority acts on emotion, documentation brings the situation back to structure. If required notice was never given, the record will show it. If a meeting was skipped, the timeline will reveal it. If a policy was enforced that does not exist in writing, the absence of that policy becomes evidence. Documentation does not accuse anyone. It simply reveals the truth. And in many cases, that truth is enough to correct the situation without conflict. The strength of documentation is that it removes the need for argument. You do not have to convince anyone of your memory. You do not have to debate what was said. You do not have to match someone else's emotion. You can simply present the record. You can say, "Here is what happened," and let the structure do the rest. This calm, steady approach often carries more weight than any emotional reaction ever could. Documentation also protects you from being misrepresented. When everything is written down, no one can claim that you refused to cooperate if you did not. No one can say you were informed of something you never received. No one can insist that a rule exists when it does not. The written record becomes your witness, your timeline, and your shield. In the age of accountability, documentation is not just helpful, it is essential. It is the tool that allows ordinary people to stand on equal footing with authority. It is the way to ensure that the rules are followed, not just assumed. It is the method by which a citizen can protect themselves without needing to fight. And it is the foundation that supports everything else in this book. Knowing the rules gives you clarity. Documentation gives you proof. Together, they give you stability in situations where others may feel lost. The next chapter builds on this foundation by explaining something that confuses many people: the difference between rules, policies, and laws. Understanding that difference is another key to navigating authority with confidence. Chapter 5: The difference between rules, policies, and laws. One of the most confusing parts of dealing with authority is that people use the words rules, policies, and laws as if they all mean the same thing. They don't. Each one has a different purpose, a different level of power, and a different process behind it. When you understand the difference, situations that once felt complicated suddenly become clear. You can see what someone is allowed to do, what they are not allowed to do, and what they are simply making up as they go. A law is the strongest of the three. Laws are created through a formal process, usually by elected officials. They apply to everyone in a city, a state, or a country. Laws cannot be changed by a manager, a supervisor, or a company. They cannot be ignored because someone is frustrated. They cannot be replaced by a memo or a sign on a wall. Laws sit at the top of the structure, and everything else must fit beneath them. A policy is different. A policy is something an organization creates for itself. It explains how the organization wants things to be done. Policies can be helpful, but they do not have the same power as laws. A policy cannot break a law. A policy cannot remove someone's rights. And a policy must be created properly to be valid. If a policy is not written down, not shared, or not adopted through the correct process, it may not be enforceable at all. Many people in authority do not understand this. They treat policies as if they were laws, even when the policy is unclear or incomplete. A posted policy without a policy number is a flyer on the wall. A rule is usually the smallest and simplest of the three. Rules are often created for specific situations. A school might have a rule about where backpacks can be placed. A workplace might have a rule about clocking in. A housing office might have a rule about where to park bicycles. Rules are meant to guide everyday behavior, but they cannot override policies, and they definitely cannot override laws. A rule that conflicts with a higher authority is not a real rule. It is just a mistake waiting to happen. When you understand the difference between these three things, you begin to see why so many conflicts happen. A manager might enforce a rule that was never written down. A supervisor might rely on a policy that does not exist. An administrator might ignore a law without realizing it. These mistakes are common because many authority figures were never taught how the structure works. They assume that anything they say becomes a rule, and anything they write becomes a policy. But that is not how the system is built. This is where the citizen gains strength. When you know the difference between a rule, a policy, and a law, you can ask the right questions. You can ask to see the written policy. You can ask where the rule came from. You can ask how the decision fits with the law. These questions are not confrontational. They are clarifying. They bring the situation back to the structure instead of letting it drift into emotion or habit. Understanding these differences also helps you stay calm. When someone tries to enforce something that does not exist in writing, you do not have to panic. When a policy is used incorrectly, you do not have to argue. When a rule contradicts a law, you do not have to guess which one matters. You already know the hierarchy. You know that laws sit at the top, policies sit in the middle, and rules sit at the bottom. And you know that anything that breaks that order cannot stand. This chapter gives you one of the most important tools in the age of accountability: the ability to see the structure clearly. Once you understand what each type of authority is and what it is not, you can navigate situations with confidence. You can protect yourself without conflict. And you can recognize when someone in authority is stepping outside the boundaries, even if they do not realize it themselves. The next chapter explains why this era is the most empowering time in history for someone who understands these differences. Because once the rules are visible and once the structure is accessible, the ordinary citizen becomes stronger than ever before. Chapter 6: Why this era is the most empowering in history. There have been many times in history when ordinary people had almost no control over the systems around them. The rules were hidden, the decisions were private, and the people in charge rarely had to explain themselves. If something unfair happened, most citizens had no way to challenge it. They had no access to the laws, no access to the procedures, and no way to prove what actually occurred. They were expected to accept whatever authority decided, even when the decision was wrong. Today, the world is different. For the first time in history, the average person has access to the same information that once belonged only to officials, lawyers, and institutions. The laws are online. The regulations are online. The grievance procedures are online. The agency handbooks are online. And every notice, every email, every message can be saved, stored, and presented as evidence. This level of transparency is new. It has changed the balance between authority and the citizen in a way that earlier generations could not imagine. This era is empowering because information is no longer controlled by a small group of people. Anyone can read the rules that govern their situation. Anyone can learn the steps that must be followed. Anyone can see the limits of authority written in plain language. And once a person understands these things, they are no longer at the mercy of someone else's interpretation. They can check the structure for themselves. They can compare what happened to what should have happened. They can see when a requirement was skipped or ignored. Technology has also changed the landscape. In the past, a person might have relied on memory or handwritten notes. Today, they can save emails, take photos, scan documents, and keep digital records that cannot be altered by someone else's opinion. A timeline can be built with a few clicks. A missing notice can be proven with a screenshot. A policy can be shown to be invalid simply by pointing out that it does not exist in writing. These tools give ordinary people a level of precision that once required professional help. Another reason this era is empowering is that many authority figures still operate as if the old world exists. They rely on habit, emotion, or workplace culture, not realizing that the people they oversee now have access to the same rules they do. They may not expect the citizen to ask for the written policy. They may not expect the citizen to know the procedure. They may not expect the citizen to keep records. When the citizen does these things, the entire dynamic shifts. The authority figure is no longer the only one who understands the structure. This does not mean that conflict becomes easier. It means that the citizen is no longer helpless. They can stand on the written rules instead of on someone else's feelings. They can rely on documentation instead of memory. They can navigate the system with clarity instead of confusion. And they can do all of this without needing a title, a degree, or a special position. The power comes from literacy, not status. This era is also empowering because people can learn at their own pace. They do not need to attend a class or hire a professional to understand the basics of jurisprudence. They can read the laws themselves. They can look up examples. They can study the procedures. They can learn how authority is supposed to work. And once they understand the structure, they can see when it is being followed and when it is not. For the first time, the ordinary citizen has the tools to hold authority accountable in a calm, steady, and informed way. They do not need to argue. They do not need to guess. They do not need to accept decisions that break the rules. They can simply point to the structure and let the structure speak for itself. This is why this era is the most empowering in history. It is not because authority has become weaker. It is because the citizen has become stronger. The rules are visible. The procedures are accessible. The records are permanent. And the knowledge that once belonged only to institutions now belongs to everyone. The next chapter explains how this knowledge allows ordinary people to protect themselves in situations that once felt overwhelming, not through force, but through understanding. Chapter 7: How Ordinary People Can Protect Themselves. When people think about protecting themselves in a system run by authority, they often imagine something dramatic. They picture arguments, confrontations, or complicated legal battles. But real protection rarely looks like that. In everyday life, the strongest form of protection comes from something much simpler: understanding the structure and using it calmly. Most situations do not require a fight. They require clarity. When you know the rules, when you keep records, and when you understand the limits of authority, you can protect yourself in a steady, quiet way that does not rely on force. You do not have to match someone else's emotion. You do not have to raise your voice. You do not have to threaten anything. You can simply stand on the written structure, and the structure will hold you up. The first way ordinary people protect themselves is by asking for things in writing. A verbal instruction can be forgotten or denied. A written instruction becomes part of the record. When something is written down, it becomes easier to compare it to the rules. If the instruction matches the procedure, you can follow it with confidence. If it does not, you can ask questions without sounding confrontational. You are not challenging the person. You are clarifying the process. The second way people protect themselves is by keeping their own records. Saving emails, writing down dates, and keeping copies of notices may seem small, but these actions create a timeline that cannot be erased. If something goes wrong later, you will not have to rely on memory. You will have the facts. And when you have the facts, you can speak calmly even when others are unsure. You can show what happened instead of arguing about it. The third way people protect themselves is by knowing the difference between what someone wants and what the rules require. Many authority figures act on habit or emotion without realizing they are stepping outside the structure. When you understand the rules, you can gently bring the situation back to the written process. You can ask, "Can you show me where that is written?" Or, "Can you point me to the policy?" These questions are not aggressive. They are stabilizing. They remind everyone that the structure matters. The fourth way people protect themselves is by staying calm. Emotion can cloud judgment, but structure is steady. When you know the rules, you do not have to react to someone else's frustration. You can stay grounded. You can take your time. You can respond thoughtfully instead of quickly. Calmness is not weakness. It is a sign that you understand the system better than the person who is acting on impulse. The fifth way people protect themselves is by understanding that they do not need to win every moment. They only need to stay aligned with the structure. If a situation becomes confusing, you can pause. You can ask for clarification. You can request the procedure in writing. You can say you will review the documents and respond later. These simple actions prevent you from being pushed into decisions that break the rules. The final way people protect themselves is by remembering that authority is not personal. It is not about who is stronger or louder. It is about who is standing on the written foundation. When you understand the structure, you do not have to fear authority. You can respect the position without surrendering your rights. You can cooperate without being taken advantage of. You can navigate the system with confidence instead of confusion. Protection in the age of accountability is not about fighting. It is about understanding. It is about using the tools that already exist. It is about knowing the rules, keeping records, and staying calm. These simple habits give ordinary people a level of stability that earlier generations never had. They turn complicated situations into manageable ones. They turn uncertainty into clarity. And they allow the citizen to stand on equal footing with authority, even when authority does not realize it. The next chapter explores why this kind of informed citizenry strengthens the entire society, not just the individual. When people understand the rules, everyone benefits, including the systems that rely on those rules to function. Chapter 8: The Civic Strength of an Informed Citizenry. A society becomes stronger when the people who live in it understand the rules that shape their lives. This strength does not come from conflict or resistance. It comes from clarity. When ordinary citizens know how authority is supposed to work, they help keep the entire system balanced. They become part of the structure instead of being pushed around by it. And in a quiet, steady way, they make the world around them more stable. Most systems are built on the idea that people will follow the rules. But rules only work when everyone understands them. When authority figures do not know the procedures, mistakes happen. When citizens do not know their rights, those mistakes go unchallenged. The result is confusion, frustration, and decisions that drift away from the written structure. But when both sides understand the rules, the system becomes predictable. It becomes fair. It becomes something people can trust. An informed citizenry does not weaken authority. It strengthens it. When citizens know the rules, they help keep authority aligned with the structure. They ask questions that bring the process back on track. They point out when a step was skipped. They remind officials of the procedures that protect everyone. This is not opposition. It is cooperation. It is the kind of cooperation that keeps systems honest and prevents small mistakes from becoming large problems. When citizens understand the rules, they also become calmer. They do not panic when something unexpected happens. They do not assume the worst. They do not feel powerless. Instead, they know where to look. They know what to ask for. They know how to compare what happened to what should have happened. This calmness spreads. It influences the people around them. It helps keep conversations grounded in facts instead of emotions. And it encourages authority figures to respond with clarity instead of frustration. A society where people understand the rules is a society where fewer conflicts escalate. Problems are addressed earlier. Misunderstandings are corrected before they grow. Decisions are made with more care because everyone knows they can be reviewed. Authority becomes more consistent because it is held to the same written standards every time. And citizens become more confident because they know the structure is something they can understand, not something they must fear. This kind of civic strength does not require advanced education. It does not require special training. It does not require a deep knowledge of legal theory. It requires something much simpler: the willingness to read the rules, keep records, and ask clear questions. These small habits create a culture where accountability is normal, not rare. Where transparency is expected, not surprising. Where authority is respected, but not blindly trusted. An informed citizenry also protects the most vulnerable members of society. People who understand the rules can help others who do not. They can explain procedures to neighbors, friends, and family. They can share information that prevents someone from being taken advantage of. They can stand beside people who feel overwhelmed and help them navigate the system. In this way, knowledge becomes a form of community support. It spreads outward, strengthening everyone it touches. The age of accountability is not just about individuals protecting themselves. It is about building a society where fairness is easier to achieve because the rules are visible to everyone. It is about creating a culture where authority is guided by structure instead of emotion. It is about giving ordinary people the tools to participate in the systems that affect their lives. And it is about recognizing that when citizens understand the rules, the entire society becomes more stable, more predictable, and more just. The next chapter brings this book full circle. It explains how everything you have learned here connects to the deeper study of jurisprudence, the architecture behind the rules themselves. Chapter 9: The Bridge to Jurisprudence. By now, you can see that understanding the rules is not a special skill reserved for experts. It is something any ordinary person can learn. It is something that grows naturally once you begin paying attention to how authority works, how decisions are made, and how procedures are supposed to unfold. This book has shown that the world is not as mysterious as it sometimes feels. The structure is visible, the rules are accessible, and the citizen who understands them becomes steady in situations that once felt overwhelming. But there is a deeper layer beneath everything we have discussed. The rules, the policies, the procedures, and the limits of authority all come from a larger architecture. That architecture is called jurisprudence. It is the study of how rules are created, how they are interpreted, and how they fit together. It explains why some decisions are lawful and others are not. It explains why some procedures protect people and others fail. It explains how authority is built, how it is limited, and how it must operate to remain legitimate. You do not need to be a scholar to understand jurisprudence. You do not need to memorize complicated terms or study ancient cases. You only need to understand the basic ideas that shape the systems around you. Jurisprudence is not about complexity. It is about clarity. It is about seeing the structure behind the rules so you can understand why the rules matter in the first place. The age of accountability prepares you for this deeper understanding. Once you know that authority often acts without full knowledge of the rules, you begin to see why structure is important. Once you know that documentation protects you, you begin to see why procedures exist. Once you know the difference between rules, policies, and laws, you begin to see how the hierarchy of authority is built. And once you know that this era gives ordinary people access to information that was once hidden, you begin to see why jurisprudence is no longer something distant or unreachable. Jurisprudence is simply the next step. It is the study of the architecture that makes accountability possible. It explains why written rules matter more than personal opinions. It explains why procedures must be followed even when they feel inconvenient. It explains why authority must operate within limits, and why those limits protect both the citizen and the system itself. When you understand jurisprudence, you understand not just what the rules are, but why they exist. This book has shown you the surface of the structure. The volumes that follow will take you deeper, but they will do so in the same spirit: clear language, steady pacing, and a focus on understanding rather than complexity. You will not be asked to memorize anything. You will not be asked to think like a lawyer. You will simply be shown how the system works, step by step, in a way that anyone can follow. The age of accountability is the doorway. It gives you the confidence to walk into the next room. It shows you that the rules are not beyond your reach. It shows you that authority is not something to fear. It shows you that the structure is something you can understand, use, and rely on. And once you see that, you are ready for the deeper journey into jurisprudence. The world has changed. The rules are visible. The structure is accessible. And the citizen who understands it becomes part of the foundation that keeps society steady. This book has given you the tools to stand on that foundation. The next volumes will show you how the foundation was built.